A powerful CEO was on the verge of a panic attack in a broken elevator, until a janitor's 6-year-old daughter calmed him with a song, and unknowingly changed his life forever. The skyscraper rose into the late afternoon sky like a gleaming monument to power, its glass windows reflecting the orange light of the setting sun. Inside, the lobby of Westcore Tower buzzed with the usual rhythm of polished shoes on marble floors, the low murmur of executives speaking into Bluetooth earpieces, and the echo of elevator chimes as people were swept upward to meetings, deals, and deadlines. But near the janitor's closet, away from all that urgency, a little girl in a white dress stood by the elevator doors, her small fingers gently tracing the seams in the wall while she waited for her mother to finish cleaning the lobby bathrooms. Emma Brooks was 6 years old, with soft brown curls that framed her curious face and wide, thoughtful eyes the color of warm soil. She came here often after school, sitting quietly with a coloring book or humming softly while her mother, Sarah, worked late shifts as a night janitor. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't what other children were doing at that hour, but Emma never complained. She knew things weren't easy. She knew her mother was tired, and she knew they didn't have the kind of life other kids at her school had. But she also knew how to wait. And how to be quiet. And how to take care of herself when needed. This time, though, her mother had nodded toward the elevator and said, "Just one ride up and back down, okay? Don't go anywhere else. I'll be right here when you come back." Emma had nodded seriously, as if she were being entrusted with a sacred mission. She stepped into the elevator just before the doors slid closed, her white dress fluttering slightly as she pressed the button for the top floor. She stood on tiptoes to reach it, smiling to herself. Just as the doors began to close, they opened again with a mechanical ding, and a man stepped in. He moved quickly, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket, tapping his phone with one hand and holding a briefcase in the other. His tailored light blue suit was crisp and flawless, his black hair slicked back with precision, and his face was tight with tension. He didn't glance down at Emma, didn't notice her standing quietly in the corner. His mind was already 1,000 floors above, lost in forecasts, mergers, meetings. This was Alexander West, the founder and CEO of Westcore, and someone used to moving through the world without ever needing to look down. He hit the button for the 22nd floor and exhaled through his nose, clearly exhausted. The elevator began to rise, smooth and silent, climbing higher through the tower. Emma looked up at the ceiling lights, watching them pass. Everything was still. Until the elevator gave a sudden, violent jolt that knocked both of them off balance. The lights flickered. Then went out. The elevator stopped. There was a humming sound as the emergency backup lighting kicked in, casting the small space in a pale glow. A low buzz filled the air. Alexander froze. He stared at the control panel, then at the ceiling, then back to the floor. He pressed the emergency button once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. His breathing quickened, his hand moved to his tie, loosening it. He turned slowly, and that's when he saw her. Emma stood completely still, looking up at him. Her head tilted slightly. "Are we stuck?" she asked, her voice small but calm. He didn't answer. His face had gone white, and his hands now gripped the brass handrail on the elevator wall. His chest rose and fell quickly, too quickly. He took a step back, stumbling slightly, and then slid down into a sitting position, one arm across his chest, the other hand pressed against the cold floor. Emma frowned. She'd seen that look before, not in an elevator, but in her mother, on the worst days, when pain or fear became too much. Her mother never called it panic. She just called it the heavy feeling. Emma knelt down next to the man. "Mister," she said, gently, not touching him yet. "Are you sick?" His lips parted, but no words came out. He was sweating, his breathing sharp and shallow, his eyes wide with fear. The walls of the elevator seemed to close in on him with every second. He tried to speak again, but all he managed was a short, ragged whisper. I can't. Emma blinked. She looked up at the ceiling, then at the emergency button, and saw the red light blink slowly. She knew help might not come quickly. And she knew that sometimes, fear made things worse than they were. So, she did the one thing that had always helped her mother in the worst moments. She began to sing. Her voice was soft at first, barely more than a whisper. A lullaby. Simple, familiar. Words about morning light and soft skies, from a cartoon she loved and had memorized completely. Her voice floated in the small metal box like a breeze. She sat cross-legged across from him and kept singing, not looking away. The man's breathing didn't stop, but it slowed. His grip loosened from the railing. His eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, he let himself drift, not into unconsciousness, but into calm. In that stillness, in the suspended quiet of the elevator, Emma's song echoed like a heartbeat. Neither of them knew it then, but something had begun to shift, something irreversible and true. The silence between them deepened, not because there was nothing to say, but because the elevator had become a different world, sealed off from time, from sound, from everything outside those four walls. Emma's voice continued to flow through the dimly lit space like a quiet current, filling in the emptiness where panic had once echoed. She sang without hesitation, the melody wrapping around the edges of the man's fraying control. It was the kind of song that didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be true. She sang not for applause or attention, but because something inside her knew this man needed her more than he would ever admit. Alexander West sat hunched in the corner, his knees pulled slightly toward his chest, his back pressed against the cold metal wall. He looked nothing like the titan of industry that financial networks praised. His hands were trembling, his shirt damp with sweat, and his usually sharp eyes were glassy and unfocused. But something was changing. As the song continued, the tension in his jaw loosened, and his shoulders, once stiff and high with panic, began to sink slightly. The grip he had on his own wrist relaxed, his breathing gradually falling into rhythm with the soft notes echoing around him. For a man who had built his life around control, whose entire empire depended on never showing weakness, this was unfamiliar territory. The elevator had reduced him to something he hadn't been in decades, vulnerable. He didn't know who this little girl was or why she wasn't afraid, but her presence, so calm and steady, was slowly undoing the fear that had gripped him since the moment the elevator froze. When Emma finally paused, her voice fading into the gentle hum of the emergency lights, Alexander opened his mouth, this time managing more than a whisper. "What's your name?" She tilted her head slightly and answered without hesitation. "Emma." He let the name settle in the air before nodding once. "Thank you, Emma." She smiled softly. "You were scared." He let out a short, embarrassed breath, half laugh, half exhale. "Still am." Emma shifted a little closer, keeping a respectful distance. "My mom gets scared too sometimes. She says fear is like a big wave, and you can either let it crush you or you can float." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, unsure what to say to a 6-year-old who spoke like someone who had already survived something. "Your mom sounds wise." "She's tired a lot. But she's strong. Stronger than me." "No," he said quietly, "I don't think that's true." Emma reached into the pocket of her white dress and pulled out a small, folded tissue. It was crumpled, soft at the edges, something a child would keep just in case. She handed it to him without ceremony. He accepted it with a nod and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "What do you do?" she asked simply. He hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He was used to people knowing, used to being recognized, asked for favors, signatures, meetings. But Emma asked like she genuinely didn't know, and didn't care. "I run a company," he answered eventually. "I make a lot of decisions." She considered that for a moment. "Do you like it?" It was such a simple question, but one no one had asked him in years. Did he like it? He used to. Once. Before the pressure, the expectations, the cold boardrooms filled with people who smiled only when the numbers were good. Before success became survival. I used to, he said finally. Emma looked up at the ceiling light and nodded, as if that made sense. Sometimes I like school. Sometimes I don't. A flicker of a smile touched the corner of his lips. It wasn't forced. It wasn't for image. It was real. How come you're here alone? He asked her gently. My mom's working. She cleans the building. She said I could ride the elevator up and down just once. I wasn't supposed to talk to anyone. He raised an eyebrow. But you did. She shrugged. You looked like you needed someone. He lowered his eyes, quietly absorbing the truth of her words. He had everything, power, wealth, influence, but in that moment, trapped in a box between floors, it was a little girl in a white dress who saw him. Not the CEO. Not the legend. Just the man. And she didn't flinch. They sat in silence again for a while, the kind that wasn't heavy but gentle. There was nothing awkward in it, only understanding. Outside, the elevator shaft was still. Somewhere far below, the buzz of maintenance teams moving through hallways echoed faintly. Help would come eventually. They both knew that. But neither of them would be the same when those doors opened. Will you sing again? He asked softly. Emma smiled, her eyes lighting up just a little. Okay, she whispered. And so she did. A new song this time, slower, like a lullaby woven from moonlight. And as her voice rose again, Alexander closed his eyes, leaned his head back against the wall, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to feel completely, unapologetically human. The minutes dragged on with a strange softness, like time inside the elevator had its own slower rhythm. Outside those steel walls, the world continued, phones buzzed, meetings started, engines roared down avenues, but inside the elevator, it was as if the city had paused just for the two of them. Emma's voice filled the space again, and Alexander simply sat, breathing in time with her melody. His panic had not vanished, not completely, but it no longer held him in its crushing grip. It pulsed quietly under his skin, manageable, shrinking with every gentle note the girl offered into the air between them. After the second song ended, she stopped and looked at him, not asking for praise or response, just checking on him, like a nurse might check a sleeping patient. He gave her the faintest nod of appreciation, and she nodded back, satisfied. Then she crossed her legs again and looked up at the ceiling lights, her fingers playing with the frayed edge of the ribbon tied at her waist. You're not scary, she said suddenly. He blinked at her, surprised. Scary? Everyone says rich people are scary or mean or, like, cold, she explained, choosing her words carefully. But you're just scared like everyone else. He let out a slow breath and rested his elbows on his knees. You're a very observant person, Emma. My teacher says I notice things. I see people's faces before they talk. Alexander looked at her, really looked at her this time. She was small, dressed simply, her hair a little uneven as if it had been trimmed at home, her dress clean but slightly faded at the seams. But her posture was poised, her gaze steady, her tone gentle and clear. She wasn't just a child. She was someone who had seen things, who had carried more than a 6-year-old should. He saw it in the way she didn't fidget, in how she didn't fill silence with noise. She didn't just know how to comfort. She knew how to wait. He leaned back, swallowing the lump in his throat. You know, when I was your age, I was terrified of small spaces. You still are, she said, not unkindly. He smiled for the first time, an honest smile that felt unfamiliar on his face. Yes. I still am. Emma tilted her head. Why? What happened? Alexander didn't speak right away. The words weren't easy. He had never said them out loud to anyone outside a therapist's office, and even then, not fully. But the small girl across from him was not judgmental. She was not probing. She simply wanted to understand, and somehow that gave him permission. I was put in closets when I was bad, he said slowly. When I lived in foster homes. Not all of them. Just some. The worst ones. If I made noise, or asked for too much, they locked me in. No light. Just cold, old paint and the sound of my own breathing. Emma was silent for a moment. Then, in the softest voice, she asked, "Did anyone come to get you?" "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes not. That's when I learned not to trust anyone." Emma nodded, absorbing that. She didn't say she was sorry, or that it was unfair. She didn't offer any platitudes. She just listened. He realized that it was more comforting than any adult's carefully chosen sympathy had ever been. "But you got big," she said. "You got out." "Yes," he said. "I got out. I built everything I thought I needed so I would never be powerless again." "Did it work?" He hesitated. The elevator groaned slightly as something shifted above them, the cables adjusting, gears whispering. But they still weren't moving. He looked up, then back at her. "No. Not really." Emma looked thoughtful. "My mom says sometimes you can build a whole world and still feel alone in it." He raised his eyebrows. "She's right." "She's smart," Emma said proudly. "And tired. All the time. But she still hums when she cooks. That's how I know she's okay." Alexander leaned his head back against the wall. "What's your mom's name?" "Sarah." "I'd like to meet her." Emma smiled again. "You will. But don't be scary." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "I'll try." They both fell quiet again. The elevator lights flickered once, and Emma's eyes darted upward. "Do you think they're coming?" "They are," Alexander said, more confidently than he felt. "I have a whole team downstairs, and I'm sure someone's already working on it." "Okay," Emma said. "Then we wait." They sat there, two strangers from different worlds, one born into privilege, the other into struggle, but somehow meeting at the same place, in the same moment, in the same silence. Something unspoken passed between them. Not just comfort or understanding, but something deeper. Recognition. As if they had both walked through darkness in different shoes and now, for a few suspended minutes, were walking side by side. And though neither of them said it, they both felt it. When the elevator moved again, they would not leave it the same. The elevator shuddered once, a low mechanical groan echoing from deep within the shaft, followed by a brief flicker in the overhead lights. Emma and Alexander both glanced up at the same time, their eyes meeting for just a second before the cabin jolted slightly and then began to move, slowly, cautiously, like a machine waking from a long sleep. Neither of them spoke. The motion itself was enough to fill the air with a hum of hope and uncertainty. Alexander released the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Emma simply straightened her dress and looked calm, as if she had known all along that the world would eventually start moving again. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, the hallway outside was filled with movement. A uniformed maintenance worker stepped forward, his face lined with concern, followed by two security guards and a woman running toward the elevator with wide, panicked eyes and yellow cleaning gloves still on her hands. It was Sarah, Emma's mother. "Emma," she cried, rushing past the men and dropping to her knees. Emma flew into her mother's arms, burying her face into her shoulder as Sarah held her tightly, trembling from head to toe. "Oh my God, baby, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have let you go alone, I didn't know, I'm okay," Emma whispered, muffled against the fabric of her mother's shirt. He was scared too. Sarah looked up then, past her daughter's hair, and saw the man standing just behind. Her face changed instantly, shifting from fear to recognition, and then confusion. She knew who he was. Everyone who worked in that building knew Alexander West. She had cleaned the floors outside his office. Seen him on the covers of magazines that people left in the lobby. But seeing him here, without the protection of silence and distance, looking equally shaken and disoriented, was something else entirely. Alexander straightened his jacket, but for once, not out of habit or image. It was more of a reflex, something to anchor himself with. He looked at Sarah for a moment and opened his mouth, as if to say something, but nothing came out. For a man who made billion-dollar decisions without hesitation, it was a strange and humbling pause. The head of building security stepped forward. "Sir, are you all right? We were tracking the system failure, but it took time to override." "I'm fine," Alexander said quietly. "The girl, Emma, she's the reason I stayed calm." The statement drew several looks, but Alexander didn't elaborate. He didn't feel the need to. The words felt heavier than usual, as if saying them had taken effort beyond the physical. Sarah blinked in confusion. "She helped you?" Alexander nodded. "She did." Sarah glanced down at her daughter, still wrapped in her arms. "She does that. She sings to me when I can't breathe. She did the same for me." Emma looked up at both of them, her expression perfectly neutral, like everything that had just happened made complete sense to her. "Can we go home now?" Sarah nodded quickly, brushing a hand over her daughter's curls. "Yes, baby. We're going home." The security guard stepped back, letting the two of them pass. But just before they turned down the hallway, Alexander spoke again. "Sarah." She stopped, surprised that he knew her name. "Yes, sir. I'd like to speak with you. Not now. But soon." Sarah hesitated, unsure if she should nod or run. She settled on a polite but guarded, "Okay." He didn't press further. He just nodded once, then turned away as his assistant, who had just arrived, began bombarding him with questions about his schedule, his safety, the malfunction. He didn't answer. His mind was still in the elevator. Still echoing with a lullaby. Later that night, in her small kitchen filled with the smell of reheated soup and the quiet clinking of utensils, Sarah watched Emma draw at the table like nothing extraordinary had happened. She had a way of settling back into life with almost no friction, like a balloon released into the air that always found a gentle place to land. "What was it like?" Sarah asked, stirring the pot absent-mindedly. Emma didn't look up from her drawing. He was scared. But he listened. Most people don't. Sarah didn't reply. She looked out the small kitchen window, toward the blinking lights of the city. Somewhere out there, in a world she'd never touched, was a man who had sat in a dark elevator beside her daughter and, somehow, been changed. In his penthouse, far above the traffic and noise, Alexander West sat in his study, a single glass of untouched whiskey on the table beside him. He wasn't reading. He wasn't answering emails. He was simply sitting, the lights dimmed low, listening to something only he could still hear, a child's voice, soft and steady, singing in the dark. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. The next morning unfolded like any other, with the city roaring back to life in its usual rhythm of chaos, commerce, and noise. But for Alexander West, nothing felt quite the same. He stood in front of the towering windows of his penthouse, a place that once felt like a symbol of everything he'd earned, and stared out at the skyline with a heaviness in his chest he couldn't explain. He was a man who had conquered the world of business, who could read financial projections like novels and close deals in minutes, but no spreadsheet could help him make sense of the way that little girl's voice had stayed with him. He heard it now in the silence of the room, soft and steady, cutting through the noise of his usual thoughts. He didn't tell anyone what had happened in the elevator, not really. His assistant asked about it in a rush of concern, spinning it into a potential PR narrative. Heroic CEO survives elevator malfunction with child by his side. But Alexander dismissed the idea almost immediately. There would be no press releases, no press conferences, no photo ops. This wasn't a story to be packaged and sold. It was personal. Instead, he quietly asked for a report of all employees who had been scheduled for cleaning services that evening. He remembered the woman's name, Sarah, and it didn't take long to find her full record in the building's vendor database. She had worked there for nearly 3 years without incident, often requested by other staff for her reliability. Emma, of course, was not on any paperwork. But now her name was etched somewhere deeper in Alexander's mind, in a place usually reserved for figures, outcomes, and stock movements. Later that week, he made a discreet phone call using a personal number rarely touched. Sarah answered cautiously, her voice sharp with protectiveness until she realized who was calling. Then it became uncertain, laced with hesitation. "I don't know what to say, Mr. West," she said quietly. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "You don't need to say anything," he replied. "I just wanted to check in. And, to ask if I could help in any way." There was a pause on the other end. Not the kind of pause that hides resentment, but the kind that carries the weight of survival, of someone used to refusing help, not because she didn't need it, but because she'd learned it never came without a price. "We're okay," she said. "We get by." "I believe you," he said sincerely. "But I also know what it's like to get by when you shouldn't have to. I'd like to offer support. For Emma. For you. Not out of pity. Out of respect." Another pause. Then, "You don't owe us anything." "I disagree," he said. "Your daughter gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. And if nothing else, I want to return that with dignity." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't hang up either. Eventually, she agreed to meet him. Not in his office. Not in a conference room. Just in a small park down the street from her apartment. When they met, Sarah was dressed simply in jeans and a worn sweater, her hair pulled back, her eyes tired but alert. Emma sat beside her on the bench, swinging her legs gently and holding a juice box in one hand. Alexander approached slowly, as if not to disrupt something sacred. He didn't come with a briefcase or contracts. He didn't wear his usual armor of wealth. Just a jacket, a quiet expression, and a question in his eyes. "I was serious about helping," he said as he sat beside them. Sarah nodded. "I know. I've just never had anyone ask like that." He turned to Emma. "How are you doing?" Emma grinned. "Better. Our elevator works." That made him laugh, a short, genuine sound that surprised even him. "That's good to hear." Over the next hour, they talked, not about business, but about life. Sarah told him about her migraines, how they made it hard to work some days. About the medical bills she was behind on. About how Emma had taught herself to tie her own shoes and could make toast without burning it. Emma spoke about school, about how she liked music and stories, but not math. Alexander listened. Really listened. It wasn't something he often did in boardrooms, but here, with them, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. By the end of their conversation, he had quietly arranged for a full health evaluation for Sarah at a private clinic. No bills. No strings. Just care. He also offered to fund Emma's early education with a scholarship, allowing her to attend a specialized arts program not far from where they lived. Sarah tried to protest at first, out of pride more than doubt, but Emma's shining eyes and quiet whisper, "Mom, please," softened her. When they stood to leave, Emma looked up at him and said, will you come to one of my music classes someday? Alexander hesitated, then knelt slightly to meet her gaze. I'd like that very much. As they walked away, he watched them, a mother and daughter bound not just by blood, but by the kind of quiet strength he'd never understood until now. They didn't have much. But they had everything that mattered. He stood in the park long after they left, watching the leaves fall gently from the trees, wondering how a man could feel so full after spending a life chasing things that never filled him at all. The elevator may have brought them together by accident, but something else, something deeper, had opened inside him, and this time, he had no intention of closing it. Weeks passed, and a quiet rhythm began to form between the three of them, something fragile and unspoken, but real. Alexander didn't try to insert himself into their lives like a savior. He was careful. He called only when he said he would, never unannounced. When he offered help, it came in the form of access, not intrusion, scholarship paperwork mailed neatly in an envelope, private clinic appointments arranged discreetly for Sarah, books and art supplies for Emma delivered with no name on the box. There were no interviews, no news articles, no public acknowledgments. He wasn't doing it for attention. He was doing it because something inside him had shifted, and he wasn't entirely sure who he was becoming, only that he didn't want to be who he was before. Sarah remained cautious, not because she didn't trust him, but because trust wasn't something she gave away lightly. Her life had taught her that help often came with expectations or with fine print that punished you for accepting it. But Alexander continued to show up, not with grand gestures, but with consistency. And when someone keeps showing up, even the most guarded heart begins to soften. Emma, of course, accepted him with a natural ease that only children seem to have. She didn't care about his suits or his reputation. She just liked that he listened, that he always kept his promises, and that he laughed at her jokes even when they didn't make sense. Once, after her music class, she handed him a drawing she had made, a little girl holding a flashlight next to a tall man in a blue suit, both inside a silver elevator. Above them, she had written in crooked block letters, "We weren't stuck. We were finding each other." He kept that picture on his desk in a thin wooden frame, positioned not facing visitors, but turned inward, so only he could see it when he worked. But life has a way of testing things just as they begin to heal. One morning, Sarah didn't answer her phone. Alexander didn't think much of it at first, maybe she had forgotten to charge it. But when Emma was absent from her music class that afternoon and the school called to ask why no one had picked her up, something inside him twisted. He left a meeting mid-sentence and drove to their apartment himself. When he arrived, he found the building manager pacing nervously in the hallway. Sarah had been found on the bathroom floor earlier that day by a neighbor. She had fainted and hit her head. An ambulance had taken her to the hospital hours ago. Emma was with the same neighbor, confused and scared but unharmed. Alexander didn't hesitate. He went straight to the hospital. Sarah was unconscious when he arrived, hooked up to monitors in a quiet room. The doctor told him she had been suffering from worsening neurological symptoms, possibly the result of untreated complications tied to a chronic condition she'd never mentioned. She had ignored the warnings. She'd missed follow-up visits. She hadn't wanted to burden anyone. He sat in the chair beside her bed, staring at the stillness of her face, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. It was the first time since the elevator that he felt the full weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders. She had given him a kind of access to something real, something grounded. And now he might lose it. Worse, Emma might lose her. He stayed in the hospital for hours, going back and forth between Sarah's room and the small waiting area where Emma sat curled in a chair, hugging her knees and staring at the floor. He didn't try to fill the silence. He just stayed close, a steady presence. When Emma finally looked up and said, "Is she going to die?" it nearly shattered him. He knelt down in front of her and took her small hands into his. "I don't know," he said, "because she deserved the truth. But I promise you, no matter what happens, you won't be alone." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. She just nodded and leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. They stayed like that for a long time. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, paperwork, and quiet waiting. Sarah eventually regained consciousness, disoriented and weak but alive. The doctors were hopeful but cautious. She would need rest, treatment, and time, none of which she could manage alone. It was Sarah herself who brought up the conversation. One afternoon, lying in bed, pale but lucid, she turned to Alexander and said, "If something happens to me, I want you to be the one to take care of her." He didn't answer right away. He simply reached for her hand and held it. "You already are," she added. "You've been that person since the elevator. You just didn't know it." Alexander didn't know how to describe what he felt in that moment. It wasn't gratitude or grief or obligation. It was something deeper, like finding your own reflection in someone else's belief. When Sarah was released weeks later, a care team was already in place. Her apartment had been modified for her recovery. Her treatment plan was funded. But more importantly, the walls between their worlds had dissolved. There were no more titles. No more acts of charity. There was only what remained after fear had passed: trust, loyalty, and something that looked very much like the beginning of a family. Alexander West had once built a life in glass towers and boardrooms, but now, without entirely meaning to, he had begun to build something else, something messy and human and infinitely more meaningful. And it had all started with a child's voice in the dark. Winter settled over the city like a heavy quilt, dimming the colors of buildings and turning street sounds into muffled echoes. Snow drifted softly between skyscrapers, dusting sidewalks and softening the steel edges of urban life. For most people, the season was inconvenient: slush, delays, freezing winds, but for Alexander, this winter felt different. It marked almost a year since the elevator. A year since a stranger's child had sat beside him and, with nothing but her voice and courage, kept him from collapsing into himself. A year since everything he thought mattered began to pale beside what truly did. He had changed, not overnight, but slowly, deliberately. His board noticed it first. He cancelled one of the largest mergers in the company's history, citing ethical concerns and community impact. Investors were furious at first, but then reports of increased employee satisfaction and local partnerships began to shift public perception. Then came the charity initiatives, not splashy or performative, but thoughtfully executed. He created a private foundation to fund education and healthcare for single-parent households in underserved communities. Internally, they called it a pivot. Privately, Alexander called it a beginning. At home, the changes were deeper, more personal. Sarah had stabilized and was doing better than anyone expected. Her health was still fragile, but with support and structure around her, she began to feel more like herself. She no longer resisted help. In Alexander's quiet consistency, she found something she hadn't had in a long time: peace. There was no romance between them, nothing like that. But there was respect, and a bond built through the shared love of the same small girl who had changed them both. Emma thrived. She attended the arts program Alexander had helped her enter, where she quickly earned a reputation as the kind of student who brought depth to even the simplest song. Her teachers said she sang like someone twice her age. When she performed, she wasn't trying to impress anyone, she was telling a truth that lived inside her. She was still the same Emma, funny, observant, a little strange in the best way, but now her world was bigger. She no longer saw life only from the sidelines. She had a stage. She had direction. And most importantly, she had people she could count on. One evening in late January, Emma and Alexander sat together in the living room of his home, the fire crackling gently, casting shadows against the stone wall. Snow flurried outside the large windows, and the hum of the city felt far away. Emma was sprawled across the rug with a notebook and colored pencils, humming quietly while sketching. Alexander watched her for a moment before speaking. "Do you remember the elevator?" he asked. Emma didn't look up. "Of course. You were brave that day." "I was scared too," she said simply. "But being scared isn't bad. It just means something matters." He leaned forward slightly. "That's something I didn't understand before. I thought strength meant control, silence, keeping things locked inside. But I was wrong." She turned and looked at him then, with that same expression she'd worn the first day, calm, curious, a little wiser than any 6-year-old had a right to be. "What changed you?" He considered the question for a moment. "You did. That moment in the elevator, you didn't run away from fear. You met it. And you stayed." Emma returned to her drawing, adding a small detail to a tree in the corner of the page. "You stayed too. You could have pretended not to see me. People do that sometimes." "I didn't want to," he said. "Not with you." She nodded like that made perfect sense. A few minutes passed before she spoke again. "What were you going to do that day? Before we got stuck?" He hesitated. It wasn't a story he had ever told her, but she deserved the truth. "I was on my way to sign a deal," he said. "It would have made my company a lot of money. But it would have hurt a lot of people with jobs and families. I didn't want to think about that part. I just wanted to win. And then you got stuck." He smiled faintly. "Yes. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like someone who had everything. I felt like a scared little boy locked in a closet. Then you sang." Emma looked at him, eyes wide with something that wasn't pride or admiration but recognition. "Sometimes we're put in the dark so we can find light." He laughed softly. "You should be teaching philosophy." "I'm 6. Even better." The fire crackled again. Outside, the snow fell in sheets now, covering the city with a blanket of silence. Alexander stood and walked to the bookshelf. He pulled out a small, wrapped box and brought it to her. "I've been saving this." Emma sat up and peeled away the wrapping paper. Inside was a music box, old-fashioned and beautifully crafted, with a silver crank on the side. She turned it slowly, and a soft melody began to play, a familiar lullaby. Her lullaby. The one she had sung in the elevator. Her eyes filled with quiet wonder. "You remembered," she whispered. "I'll never forget," he said. She stood, walked over to him, and wrapped her arms around his waist. He knelt and hugged her back. Neither of them spoke. In that moment, there were no titles, no debts, no expectations. There was only a girl who had dared to sing in the dark and a man who had finally learned how to listen. And in the warmth of that shared silence, something rare and beautiful took root. Spring arrived with a quiet kind of celebration, the way it always did in the city, not with parades or fanfare, but with the slow return of color. Trees lining the sidewalks began to bud, their bare branches dressing in soft greens and early blossoms. The air, once harsh and metallic, now carried the scent of rain and warming stone. And through it all, time moved forward, pulling with it the small lives that had grown so deeply intertwined over the past year. Emma was no longer the girl who had hummed lullabies inside an elevator. At 7, she had become something more than just precocious. There was an ease in her voice when she spoke to adults, not because she wanted to impress them, but because she genuinely saw them. She had an intuition that made people pause, made them rethink their tone, their words, even their own posture. Her music teacher said she was special, not just talented, but magnetic, like her voice carried something people didn't even know they needed until they heard it. She didn't talk about fame, and she didn't want attention. She just wanted to keep singing. And now, with everything Alexander and Sarah had built around her, she could. Sarah's recovery was slow but steady. With medical support, a nutritionist, and time she could finally afford to take for herself, she began to rediscover her own life beyond just survival. Sometimes, she still struggled to believe that it was real, that someone had stepped in not to rescue her, but to walk beside her. Alexander never treated her like a project. He never made her feel small. He just showed up, again and again, in quiet, specific ways that reminded her she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. She told him once, during a rare moment of vulnerability, "It's strange how something as terrible as that elevator could have saved all three of us." And maybe that was true. Maybe the darkness they had all faced in different ways had done more than trap them, it had stripped away what didn't matter and forced them to see what did. Alexander West, the man who once measured his life in quarterly earnings and merger percentages, had become someone else entirely. He still ran Westcor, but not the same way he used to. The board meetings were different now. He listened more. He asked harder questions. He invested in people, not just ideas. And when journalists tried to dig into his transformation, they found no scandal, no rebranding, no headline-worthy downfall. Just a man who, one day, decided to start doing things differently, and never stopped. But for all the structural changes, the real transformation lived in the small, unnoticed parts of his life. He no longer lived alone in his glass tower. Though Sarah and Emma kept their own home, they were present in his life every week. Holidays, Sunday dinners, music recitals, hospital checkups, he was there. Not as a guest. As family. He had even started mentoring other children at the music academy Emma attended, offering scholarships anonymously, staying in the back rows during performances so the spotlight never fell on him. One of those evenings, after a spring recital where Emma sang a solo that hushed the entire auditorium, Alexander sat with her beneath a tree in the school courtyard. The sun had dipped low, turning the sky into brushstrokes of lavender and gold. Emma rested her head on his shoulder, still in her performance dress, her cheeks flushed from applause and excitement. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked quietly. "About what?" "The elevator." "All the time," he said. "Me too," she whispered. "But not the scary part. The moment right after. When it was quiet, and I realized you were listening." He looked down at her, heart tight in his chest. "You taught me how to listen." She smiled. "And you taught me how not to disappear." There it was again, that clarity, that knowing that only she could bring. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter. Handwritten. Emma took it carefully and opened it. The handwriting wasn't his. It was Sarah's. Asterisk, if you're reading this, it means I trust him. It means I trust you. And it means that the world didn't break you, it built you. I don't know how much time I'll have, but I do know this. What you're becoming, what you're doing, is already more than I ever dreamed for you. Keep your voice strong. And always use it for something true, asterisk. Emma folded the letter slowly and held it against her chest. She didn't cry. She just breathed in deeply, like the words had filled something in her she hadn't realized was empty. "She gave it to me months ago," Alexander said. "She asked me to wait. Until you were ready." Emma looked out across the courtyard, watching as families and students slowly packed up their things, the sounds of laughter fading into the evening. "She was always ready," she said. "She just wanted me to believe I was too." As the sky darkened and the lights in the school windows flickered on, Alexander and Emma sat together beneath the tree, saying nothing more. There was no need. Their story wasn't defined by the night they were trapped, or even by what came after. It was built in the quiet moments, the ones no one else would ever see, the lullabies, the letters, the snowstorms, the shared dinners, and the way they had all chosen to stay, even when life gave them every excuse to leave. And if someone had passed by that night and asked who they were, this sharply dressed man and the girl with the knowing eyes, they wouldn't have seen a CEO and a janitor's daughter. they would have seen something far rarer. A family born not from blood, but from courage, from choice, and from a single moment of light in the dark.